depending on where you're joining from. My name is Ishmael Zulu. I work as a policy officer at the Tax Justice Network Africa, and I will be your moderator for today. Before getting the meeting started, maybe just to give you a few pointers, we're using the webinar format. So if you want to contribute, feel free to utilize the chat option. We also have a Q&A box. Feel free to use that when you want to contribute to the discussion. You can also raise your hand and I can allow you to speak. There will be a time in the meeting where we'll allow for contributions from all attendees. So feel free to do that. For interpretation, we have interpretation both English and French. So you can choose your preferred language at the bottom. Just to repeat that, in case you didn't hear me, pour les francophones, nous avons d'interprétation. Si vous voulez français, vous pouvez choisir le canal français. So today, I'm sure you all know why we're here. We're launching the report. I'm super excited for the launch of this report, our report on the use of research evidence in influencing government policies towards fair tax systems in Africa. And I think it's a very timely discussion to have in ensuring the use of research evidence in informing the policy-making process, considering what the African continent has seen in terms of economic decline over the last 2 years on account of the COVID-19 pandemic. Not to preempt too much, but in the work that we're doing with this report on the use of research evidence, it takes me back to when I was a young activist and had just joined the civil society sector. I remember giving a presentation, a particular presentation on the agriculture sector and how subsidies are administered in the agriculture sector. And I was quite young and I was giving a presentation. Following the presentation, interestingly, one of the older men who had been working in the agriculture sector for a long time approached me and says, young man, that was a very good presentation. I remember giving this presentation 20 years ago to the then Minister of Agriculture. And it opened up my mind and it got me thinking, these are things that have been spoken about for the last 20 years, but then what can be done differently to ensure that policymakers are actually taking on the recommendation that civil society organizations are making. To quickly run you through our program for today, we'll have introductions. Then we'll have the opening remarks, which will be given by the Executive Director for TJNA, Mr. Alvin Mosioma. Then we'll have the presentation, which will look at the report, which will be given by Busi Sibeko, who's a researcher at IEJ. Then we'll have a panel discussion where we'll have specific a country context provided with, we'll start with Tunisia. We'll have Amin El Kamel, who's representing OTE. We have Mr. Chinedu, who's representing CISLAC from Nigeria. And we have Mr. Isaac Maipopo, who is the Executive Director at CTPD, Center for Trade Policy and Development. Real quick, I'll allow each person to introduce themselves. I'll start with our Executive Director, Mr. Alvin Mosioma. You can briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you, Ishmael. You have actually already introduced me, but I will still invite and introduce myself. Alvin is my name. Mosioma, I work with Isaac at the Secretariat of the Tax Justice Network Africa, and it's really a pleasure to be here, and Happy New Year to everyone who has managed to join us.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Alvin. Isaac, you can briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Ishmael, and greetings to all that are joining. Greetings equally to our fellow panelists. Maybe if I can also switch on my, I don't know.
Yeah.
So as introduced, my name is Isaac Maipopo. I work for the Center for Trade Policy and Development, which is a civil society organization based here in Zambia. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isaac. A lot of people have asked me if I'm your brother. I'm not sure why, but I think, yeah, we can call each other brothers.
Oh, yeah.
I'll go to Amin. You can introduce yourself next.
Hi, my name is Amin El-Kamel. I'm from the Tunisian Observatory of Economy, which is an NGO from Tunisia. And Happy New Year to everyone. I'm happy to see all those beautiful faces here again.
Thank you so much, Amin. I'll go to Chinedu.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon from where I sit. My name is Chinedu Basi. I work as a program manager with Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center, CISLAC for short. I'm happy to be part of this process.
Thank you so much, Chinedu. Lastly, we'll have Busi. Busi, you can briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone, and I'm a research and economist at the Institute.
Busi, sorry, I'll ask you to, if you can introduce yourself again. I don't know if it's just me, but it was breaking a bit.
Oh, yes, I see. I think my network is unstable. I'll sort that out. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, I'm Busi Sibeko, and I'm a researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice in Johannesburg, South Africa. And we've really been excited and honored to be part of this process of developing this report.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Busi. At this point, we'll go ahead with our program. I would like to invite our Executive Director, Mr. Alvin Mosioma, just to deliver the opening remarks to open up the meeting. Alvin, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you once again, Ishmael. And indeed, you do look very much like Isaac for some reason. Everyone, thank you. Thank you very much. And once again, a Happy New Year. I don't know how long we can keep saying Happy New Year. I think till probably the end of January. It's really a pleasure to be here and to join you all in this exciting webinar. Over 1.5 years ago, when we decided to look into this very specific issue, we were all tapping in the dark because there are a number of assumptions way the decision take priority, what is the role of evidence. As you know, many of us in the civil society and in the academia invest quite significant resources in generating knowledge with understanding that that knowledge will contribute to pushing the different agendas that we push. The study that we are launching today is very unique in the sense that this is, at least to our awareness, the very first study of this nature that specifically looks at the fight towards tax justice and the role that evidence plays in influencing the policy decisions around or towards fair taxation. It's a very unique study, and we are hoping that the conversation we are having today is not just the first one, but it will play a critical role for the different actors that are engaged and pushing about the amount of knowledge that this study presents, and I will not want to preempt the presentation that will be made by the main presenter, Busi, who was the key researcher on this study. But I think there are 3 or 4 things in the introduction that I would like to underscore. The first is really that it's absolutely important to really delve deeper to understanding the dynamics that influence policy, not only just in the tax area, but more specifically in the tax arena. And for the tax arena, it's even more important because the contestations around taxation. Tax is not just a technical issue, but it's a political issue. Any decisions that are made on taxation have winners and losers. Decisions that government make on tax policy have direct bearing on different actors in this space, and therefore understanding what the role that evidence plays is critical. Secondly, I think for advocates, for us who see ourselves as change makers, as community change makers, it's really important to delve deeper into the correlation between the use of research evidence to inform policy making and other underlying factors such as issues around credibility, around the political momentum, around the political will, and the other issues that I think are critical in terms of influencing policy in the research arena. Lastly, I think of course there will be no one bullet solutions. Each country is different. There are different political dynamics, and it's really important university not just carry a broad study, but we went deeper into the different country context. And I'm really excited to hear more from different presenters from the different countries that will be presenting the analysis from their different both issue, but also from the country specific context, which have huge implications. So that in terms of the decisions and that we take forward, or the recommendations that we take forward to underscore the importance of understanding the country dynamics and the country context that lead to the direction or the decisions that country make. Again, in that short, is really to welcome you all once again, and to hope that after the presentation, you'll have opportunity to have even a more in-depth conversations. Thanks once again, and then back to you, Ishmael.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alvin. I think similarly to you, I'm equally excited to hear from the different country contexts, because I think through that you can learn a lot. You can learn a lot of things that you could do differently, try things that you could do differently in your specific country that could work. I'd like to, at this point, we'll be going into the main presentation. But before doing that, I want to do a small exercise for those that are joining us, just to make sure that you can hear us loud and clear. Kindly type in the chat which city or country that you are joining us from, just so we can see which countries are represented in the meeting today. If you can quickly type that as Busi prepares to come in with her presentation. Busi, are you ready? Are you good to go? Great. So I'm seeing we have a number of people joining us. We have Nairobi, we have Johannesburg, South Africa, we have Scotland. That's interesting. We have Zimbabwe, we have Kenya. We also have London. That's great. We have Mauritius. We have Senegal. So we have quite a number of countries represented. Thank you so much. Busi, I'll hand over to you at this stage. Busi, if you're speaking, you're muted. I can see you're sharing your screen.
It's back to the Zoom. We've been on holiday so long that I forgot not to mute myself. But thank you for that. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today to really share. We'd like to share with you all our findings on understanding the role of civil society research in influencing government policies towards fair tax systems in Africa. And I'll be unpacking what we found in the report, and my fellow panelists will give more of the context specificities that lead to these findings. So just to give some background, and Alvin began to do this, I think it's important that we emphasize that this is an exploratory research project. and that it only scopes 4 countries, even though, of course, we've called it Africa. It does scope from a variety of regions on the continent. But of course, as an exploratory research, it could lead to broader research across countries to find similarities and so forth. And so, which is why we've called it exploratory. But really, it's really to look at the relationship between civil society organizations specifically. There's many ways in which we can assess the use of research evidence, and most studies have broadly focused on research evidence broadly and not necessarily on specific institutions. And in this case, we focused on civil society organizations. The key research questions that we were looking to answer is 1, how have policymakers used CSO research evidence in policymaking? And 2, which I think is a very important one, is what factors influence the extent to which policymakers use research evidence generated by civil society organizations? As I've already stated, we looked at cases from a variety of regions, and we've got 4 main case studies here. As you see, the Tunisian Observatory of the Economy, where we looked at investment codes. We looked at civil society legislative, CISLAC for short, and we looked at the taxation of the informal sector. We looked at CTPD, the taxation of the tobacco industry, and we looked at CSOs, Uganda double tax agreements. And these cases are very interesting because, for example, the TUI one teaches us about how is research evidence used in a context where, for example, a decade ago, civil society organizations were not as involved or were not allowed to be as involved in the policy-making process. So what does it look like when more CSOs are able to partake in the policy-making process, decision-making itself? And then when we look at CISLAC, it's interesting because, of course, the taxation of the informal sector is a very contentious topic. You know, is it fair to tax the informal economy, and what does that look like? And when we look at the CTPD one, it is particularly interesting because how do we weigh the health implications of the tobacco industry when we think about taxation and incentivizing against the use of tobacco to preserve health benefits? And at the same time, how do we think about tobacco as a way to generate revenue when it is a critical part of the economy itself? And of course, with CSOs Uganda, the double tax agreements, it shows us it's about how do we engage with other countries and what does synergies and harmonizing of tax policy, not just at a national scale, but on an international forum look like, and how can that be more fair? So these were selected from TJNA's a base of membership, and we came to these 4 case studies. But critical was that these civil society organizations themselves had to be able to say that they claim that there's been use of research evidence, and I'll be getting more into that, which is what we were assessing. We began with our methodology, and I think it's important that I highlight here that, you know, get into the methods, but the methodology is about how did we understand the research that we're embarking on. And so it's important that I highlight to you that where our approach was that we need to understand that tax policy is highly context specific, originating in fiscal pressures of political changes. Reforms, therefore, often reflect the influence of contemporary as well as historical, social, political, and economic pressures in a country. And why is this important? It's because theories of tax themselves have evolved so much over the last century at a global scale, but also at a local scale. When we think about structural adjustment programs, for example, on the African continent, how do those intersect with the perceptions of tax at the time? Even in today's contemporary space, what do we think of as fair taxation versus what was thought of as fair taxation in the 2000s, for example? And so, as you know, and I won't go into the whole timeline, which is in the report itself, but as the world of tax or the theories of tax have evolved, we came to the 80s where there was this new way of thinking, so to speak, which was about saying that policies should be based on evidence, right? So evidence-based policy making became a big phenomenon in the 80s. So it was about what works. You know, we need to implement things that we know work. But of course, this has a lot of shortfalls because, as we know, some decisions are deeply political. What might work in theory might not necessarily be desirable in a particular context. Or what might work might actually not be considered to be fair in a particular context. And how do we decide what works? Who decides what works? How do we, you know, think about what is this research evidence, who generates it, and what is considered legitimate versus not legitimate research evidence? And of course, policy making itself is a non-linear process. So at what points is research evidence interacting into this process itself? And so because of this evidence-based policy making time in the world, what emerged is a study called the Use of Research Evidence Study, which is what this paper is based on, to say, okay, we think that policy should be driven by evidence, but how do we assess the use of research evidence on a global scale? So the use of research evidence as a subfield of social study has been around for about 4 decades, where people have been trying to understand in various contexts when evidence has been used to lead to policy outcomes. And so that's where we situate our study. And as Alvin has already pointed out, this kind of study is, you know, one of the few, and we believe that on a global scale, that is on the African scale, there's less studies, so to speak, and ones of this nature even rarer based on our research. But to say that we are contributing to a broader field of the use of research evidence. And I'm going to get to the findings soon, and I'm going to quickly go through the definitions so that we're all on the same page. So as I've said, URE is a subfield in social research, and what they're interested in studying is the influences on research use, which is what we'll be going through in this this presentation, the targets of research use. So who are the targets of the research? In this case, we're looking at policymakers. And then the claims about research use, because it's one thing for an organization to say, hey, this policy has changed and it's because we contributed to the process or we wrote the policy. And it's another thing to say, you know, we wrote the research and we think the policymakers somewhat used it to get to this outcome. So how do we know where the research has emerged from, whether it's really been used and how it has been used? And in our paper, when we defined research evidence, we took a broader approach because we didn't want to narrow it down. Traditional assumptions of research evidence is that it has to be quantitative, it has to be hard research. You must show that, you know, if you implement this tax policy, it will result in 50 billion rand of tax revenue, or, you know, these are the quantitative impacts of this policy proposal. But we see it as a broad knowledge, and it doesn't necessarily have to be hard evidence in terms of quantitative. We took qualitative evidence that's very critical, and the ways in which outputs shape-shift, so to speak, because as CSOs, as we know, sometimes you write a fact sheet, sometimes you write a working paper, sometimes you write a report, and it comes in different formats. So we were very interested in understanding what kind of outputs were generated from the CSOs themselves, which could be considered, or outcomes rather, of research evidence. And we also define use broadly in a sense that we do not believe that use is a once-off event, like I used this today, but to say that sometimes research evidence can be told. I can tell Ishmael about this report, and then Ishmael could go and utilize, you know, tell somebody else about it, and then only the 5th person actually reads the report. And so it's not a once-off event, it's that we inputted this research at this point, and at point B, it was, you know, this outcome. So it's very important when we understand the use to understand that it's complex and non-linear. And so we tried as best as we could to follow, you know, where the use was and how it was used and how it might have changed over time, and we'll see with some of the case studies why this is important. And of course, as I've already mentioned, we used case studies, and how we also did it was we had in-depth interviews with different people, and I'll give you the breakdown shortly. So in Tunisia, we reviewed primarily between 2012 and 2018. So it was important that we specified the period of review of when a particular type of policy was proposed and when it was the claimed use, so to speak. We conducted 6 interviews, 3 CSOs, stakeholders, and policymakers. I won't go through all of these, but I thought it would be important to understand that in various contexts, we interviewed policymakers and CSO stakeholders themselves to understand the processes through which policy research evidence was generated itself, because we wanted to understand how did the researchers conduct the research? Like, what did they do? Did they go to Google first and what did they write a report? What was the thinking? Where did the idea come from? And then what was the outputs and the usage in the policy making process? I'm going to go through the individual case findings, the claimed influence, and the summary of findings about the use of research evidence in various contexts. And of course, the other panelists will give you even greater depth of context. So in Tunisia, what we were interested in was the revision that was made to the tax incentives law. And so the initial tax incentives law was created in 1993. So this was a change after a very long time, but also in Tunisia, like I said, there'd been major shifts in civil society participation in these processes themselves. And so from 2012 and so forth, you saw more CSOs enter the space actually. And so TUI was one of these critical organizations that established themselves in the sector as being critical for economic research in itself. And Amin will tell you more about that. But in our findings, we find that, what made the adoption of the tax incentive law that TUI had proposed at the time was that it was influenced by the fact that it was a context in which policymakers were seeking major legal reforms. So it means that for CSOs, as we look and think about what policies do we want to propose, is it a moment that our governments themselves are seeking new ways of thinking, or is it that they're closed off or not interested? And I think this plays a critical role in whether there'll be uptake. I think waiting for the right time in the TUI was very critical. So why was there uptake? And in fact, an adoption of the policy proposal that they'd written, was that it was about the right time. Even though they'd written the studies prior to the moment, 2017, what they'd done is that they'd repurposed and monitored the parliamentary processes over time and identified a moment in which they felt that their research evidence would be uptaken by the policymakers themselves. And so I think a CSO is understanding that you might write a paper today, but it doesn't mean that advocacy or increased advocacy on the issue today will lead to uptake. It might be in 2 years' time or a year from now or whenever. And it was important that TUI is considered a nonpartisan CSO. So how are we politically affiliated? The sense that they were giving really research evidence that was not politically driven for a particular agenda was an important element of it, but also they had strong quantitative arguments in themselves. The sense, even though I said we looked at the broad research evidence for how it's generated, but the quantitative element was very strong, which, the cost assessment or what is perceived as neutrality when you present numbers. And those are the biases that we have to go up against. I think the other thing that made the uptake of the policy in TUI possible was the fact that they demonstrated that it had been possible in similar countries. So Morocco and Senegal were the examples that they used in their reports or their proposal to show that this is possible here in Tunisia because it's been done elsewhere and this is how they've done it. There was continuous engagement with MPs, I think sustained engagement, relationship building, so that, you enable the policymakers themselves to understand where you're coming from and have those relationships with them was important. And tailoring, I know this sounds, to some people, there's been some backlash around this, but it's tailoring to say that the argument is the same. We need a tax incentive that is different. But because remember that they are dealing with MPs with political affiliations, it's important that we speak to MPs where they are interested in. What are they interested in? They might be interested in health, but proposing a tax incentive of this nature to finance health might be beneficial, for example. In Nigeria, as I already said, it was quite complex, and looking at the research on taxing the informal sector itself is quite, there's a lot of debate around the fairness of taxing people in the informal sector. But of course, in the Nigerian case, it was interesting because the informal workers themselves were willing to pay the taxes, and what they didn't want was to be extorted or to be double taxed or to be, taken advantage of, which is what was really happening. You had basically a middleman who was collecting the taxes, and so the taxes were sometimes arbitrary and weren't based on a real, this is a 15% tax or so forth. So there's a lot of also human rights violations happening in that context. And so in this case, SLAC was really interested in about how do we harmonize the existing tax. So they didn't introduce a new tax for the informal sector. What they did was to push local governments to harmonize the taxes so that they'd be fairer. And in some cases, which is quite unique, is that they were able to reach user or tax agreements with the local government to say that if this much tax is collected, these are the benefits that the informal workers should have in their informal markets, for example, access to sanitation and so forth. So that was what this case was, and why we kept this case in as a part of this study. And what we found about why there was uptake, or what were the influences for uptake or non-uptake, you could say, was that there's this desire in Nigeria to diversify revenue sources. And so informal tax is one of the ways to think critically about what the government is getting themselves. And so because you've got this middleman in the local context, that government is actually not getting all the tax that is due to them. Because of these, like I said, the corruption, the extortion that is happening on the ground. So the administrative part was weak in that element. And so the other thing was that the policymakers, at least at the local government, thought it was important, but at the federal level and so forth, and because Nigeria's got a 3-tier tax system, you see differences in how people think about it. When we interviewed the federal level policymakers, we found that there was a bias towards research from universities, private sector, and not necessarily CSOs. And in fact, one of the policymakers indicated that CSO evidence is only, or research is only a basis for further research. And so they do not take CSO research as being, the beginning start point for their own real consideration, but thought of it as sort of, we'll take it, but we're going to get our own people to do it, which is a bit concerning. But at the local level, it is different, of course, because also the capacity or the ability to have these external researchers is also different. And so the other thing that was important was that their reputation. Oxfam, CISLAC are organizations that are well known in the Nigerian context. And so the policymakers, one of them indicated that they generally trusted the research evidence that came out of these organizations because of their reputation that they've established in the sector. And they, there was a heavy bias towards evidence-based policy making. So they indicated that they are interested in evidence-based policy making. But again, like I've already indicated, even EBP itself has shortfalls because, what works, who decides what works, and how do they decide what works is a political process in itself. And one of the concerns is, of course, the political interests, like I've already indicated, even in the Tunisia case. So at the local level, what are the political interests? What do governments have to gain from, reforming the tax system or not gain? There was some reports of corruption that in fact, some of these governors might be getting a cut from these middlemen abusing the tax structure itself. And so is it include is it about optimizing the tax system, or is it about individuals who are self-interested, was a critical component to consider. And of course, the leadership changes. So one of the things that was important was identifying that when leadership changes, it means that the mandate of what the new leadership is trying to do might change. So you need sustained public engagement to keep, the use of research or the research evidence that you've produced, to keep it on the table for whichever administration takes over. In Zambia, of course, as I've already indicated, there's a tension between the health component and the tax revenue component. But of course, in this case, it's an ongoing context, and I think maybe we can get an update around where the process is now. But what was clear was that in the context of thinking about tobacco taxes, the policymakers seemed interested in CTPD's research and willing to engage with them and work with them on the research evidence itself through the different stages, the conceptualization and so forth. And so the preliminary evidence is showing that when you bring along policymakers from the beginning, there's a responsiveness. When you do the capacity building, when you bring them along and get their expertise, your expertise, the use is probably going to, the uptake rather, is going to be high. But I'm going to go in a bit into some of the considerations later about this, the political considerations. So in Uganda, it was quite challenging to assess the extent that, the DTAs or double tax agreements proposals have been used, because of course it's a closed process and you cannot, not everyone has access to this information about what the DTAs themselves include. But initially, what we found anecdotally and also from the policymakers themselves that we interviewed and the CSO is that the policymakers felt that the research evidence that had been put out by CSOs on their website was actually quite useful. So the ability to go online and access this information and, through media, through social media. So even though it might not necessarily be a CSO researcher going straight to policymakers, but it was clear that the policymakers knew about CSOs and were able to access this information, which they thought, and agreed that they'd used it, in the broad sense of use in various contexts. The capacity building component was very important because, again, how do you get these policymakers to know and understand the research evidence that you produce? It's also about ensuring that they've got this capacity to do so, to understand the research evidence. So this was also noted as a positive factor in uptake. But also the other thing that we realized, which is important, is the role of country donors in influencing government policy-making processes. And so this can be twofold. It can be positive or negative. It can be positive if, of course, the country donor is, and we're talking about international institutions, financial institutions here, if they're interested in the policy that you're proposing, of course, the uptake will be high because then there's already pressure to uptake the policy. But if they're against the policy proposal, it presents particular challenges. But what this case study shows us is that our national policy pursuits, how they're influenced by international factors that, are not beyond our control, but how there are power dynamics that determine the uptake of policy itself. So I'm going to go into the synthesis of the findings. I think I'm going over my time now. But what was clear for us is that the three common threads between all the case studies was that the quality of research evidence was not the constraint. So you find a lot of studies say that maybe it's because the CSOs themselves are not producing good research, but that's not what we found. We didn't find that necessarily that it was the research outputs itself, but in fact, it was the non-technical constraints, which I'll be going through shortly, that were the challenge. It wasn't about the production of the research or the research, but it's the political factors. It is the, access to the information factor. It's about capacity. It's about, the political climate, international factors, and so forth. And the access to relationships with policymakers was very important because this is not true for all CSOs on the African continent. The scope of organizations that we looked at all had to varying degrees access to policymakers. Because remember, some CSOs don't necessarily have access to policymaking processes themselves. In some countries, they're more transparent, participatory processes. But in this case, in all these cases, there was a degree of access, which was important. And then the last one was the demand for new policies. And I've already mentioned this to say that across the studies, what you see is that it is a particular moment, international or local, where there's a desire or demand for new policies. And this can be for a number of reasons, like I've already said. One could be the pursuit to diversify domestic resources or increase them. The other can be the level of internationalization in the policy topic. So we are in the COVID moment, you know, everyone is talking about healthcare or whatever the topic is, might influence directly the uptake in itself. And so here I'll just go briefly through I think I've already gone through this actually, but I won't go too much into the details. But to say I'll go into lessons as I'm running out of time, and I hope people will have clarifying questions so that I can go through all of these things in more detail. So we had a number of lessons that we could draw out from these cases to consider on how to improve the likelihood of policymakers using research evidence. So how can, as CSOs, what do we need to do to ensure that, you know, there's an increase in the uptake of our research evidence? And the first one is increase policymakers' demands. And what does that mean? It means that you can generate as much research evidence as you want, but it is important that we generate demand. And this can be done in a number of ways. One of the ways is to say capacity build policymakers so that you put into the arena the need for particular policy change, because good research can only go so far. You know, good research doesn't mean there'll be uptake, as I've already said. So we need to think about some of these things. How do, you know, what kind of programs are needed in place to ensure that policymakers have access to our information so that there's a desire to actually use it. The other one was that, you know, one of the things as CSOs, we need to target individuals or groups of policymakers as part of ongoing engagement. This idea of taking them along. And of course, there are complications, because if you bring in policymakers too early on, it might mean that there are issues around, you know, at the end of the process, is the policy uptaken because they were part of the creation, or is the policy uptaken because they genuinely believe that this is the policy that needs to be done? So it does create a conflict of interest in a way. So it's important that as CSOs, we navigate the space about where in the process do we want to include policymakers, but they should be part of the process such that we're not just giving them a final output, was one of the things that was emerging. And then we've got building nonpartisan reputation. This was critical across the case studies, that the CSOs were not seen as politically driven for agendas. And so how are CSOs perceived in the space? How do we need to rebrand so that we're perceived positively in the space as generators and creators of information or research evidence in the space? And ensuring accessibility, I think, was important in a sense that, as I've already indicated, that in Siatini's case, it wasn't always giving a policymaker the information, but ensuring that the information is accessible. I think what was interesting in the CTPD, in the CISLAC case as well, was that they created a documentary which was very creative in teaching people, informal workers, about their rights and their rights and fair taxation itself. And it's also building internal capacity. So even though we've said that the research evidence that was produced is good and so forth, but to say, how do we continuously produce better research evidence? And this has nothing to do with quantitative research evidence only, but to say, how do we broadly strengthen our research evidence and how we produce it internally and capacitate internally so that we can also capacitate externally, particularly policymakers. And then entering the policymaking process strategically. There is a case where the policymakers indicated that the CSO had entered into the wrong forum. And so do we understand which forums, we need to be partaking in? Is it the, Fiscal Financial Commission? Is it the, post-budget analysis, and where in the policy cycle or which physical spaces, Parliament, do we insert our research evidence into? Because of course, if you insert the research evidence into the wrong space, then it's likely not going to be uptaken because it's not the profile of that particular avenue. We also had some recommendations for funders, and these are based on, some of the questions we began asking as we were writing this report, but also other papers that had written about funders and research evidence in itself. And so this is a compilation of both. And we say here that, it's critical that funders invest in understanding the context. Again, we've said that research evidence or fair tax, and fair tax particularly, is very context specific. So how do funders understand and better support the work that we're doing at a local level, the political complexities, the contextual complexities, so that they support our work better. And in terms of involving CSOs in the co-creation of funding programs and modalities from the outset. So this was with the idea that, as I've already indicated, you might generate a report in 2012, but it might take 6 years actually for that report to make itself into the policy-making process, because timing is important. And so how do we understand funding, or the flexibility of funding while a project or research evidence is being generated, and what is happening in that political or local context? How do we support the work in the future? How do we assess the success of the project in the event that, let's say, the research evidence doesn't make it directly into the policy-making process? We spoke about funding internal capacity. Of course, it's an ongoing issue across the board. It's not just about programs and the advocacy component, but it's about the people within those organizations, grappling with research evidence, producing better research evidence. How do we support that? And some of the ideas that came about was, how do we connect different CSOs on the continent, or funders? How do they connect different CSOs, universities, to the CSO to enhance their research evidence itself? And of course, I've already covered reconsidering funding timelines, funding non-traditional advocacy. As seen in the Siatini case, the website was a very critical component. So how do we have, better websites? How do we have non-traditional media, documentaries, creative ways of doing advocacy funded? How do we get those funded as part of the use of research evidence process, or increasing the uptake? And assessing the visibility and positionality. This is important because what is also emerging and important is that governments or policymakers have perceptions about organizations based on who their funders are. And so sometimes, in some cases, it might actually work against the CSO that has produced the research evidence to have a certain funder being on the front line and hyper visible, in their work. And so how do funders understand their positionality in terms of output? How visible are they in your research evidence itself? Are they on the front page as a logo and so forth? And so that's one thing that we thought is important, because the politics of it might mean the research evidence isn't used because there's a bias against the funder themselves. And so, the uptake requires that funders themselves are hyper aware of this, but also CSOs themselves. And of course, creating an ecosystem of research production and access. So increasing uptake also means strengthened relationships between institutions. In the Nigeria case, it's evident that policymakers are biased towards certain institutions. How do we remove the bias in a way? How do we cross-share research evidence? How do funders facilitate, rather, the cross-sharing of information? And I've already mentioned this one across CSOs themselves. So I'm going to end there. I've given a quick debrief of a 60+ document. But I hope everyone will read it to get the nuances around the specific case studies and what we found in each context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vusi. And you just to stay within the time frame. So that is good. I think at this stage, we'll go straight into the panel discussion. But before going into the panel discussion, I was looking at the chat, and we have people from different countries. We have Cameroon, we have South Sudan, we have South Africa, we have Zimbabwe, we have Mauritius, and these countries weren't included in the study, but we definitely want to hear from you. So I think we'll pick about maybe 2 or 3 countries after the panel discussion, and you can share with us what your experience has been like in terms of the use of research evidence with policymakers. What has worked in your countries? What can we learn from you? What has not worked? So if there's anyone from the countries that are not, that's not Tunisia, Zambia, Uganda, and Nigeria, please, we'll be happy to hear from you, your various country context specifics. At this stage, we'll go into the panel discussion, and to start with, I would like to invite Amin. Amin, when you come in, please introduce yourself again. I'm sure there's people that joined in a bit late that missed your introduction, so please introduce yourself again and briefly tell us about the specific Tunisia context.
So, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Buzzy. You captured everything, all the process that we've been doing in Tunisia. So even the context, she really did well. Just to present myself, I'm Amin El-Kamel from Tunisian Observatory of Economy. In fact, the Tunisian Observatory of Economy is a CSO from Tunisia. We present ourselves as a watchdog for international financial institutions to highlight the impact of their role and influence on public policy making in Tunisia. As Busy mentioned, we've been working since 2012 on the policy making process, and we've been engaged with MPs. And what helped us with that is that the Tunisian context after 2011, the political system has shifted to a democratic system. So even the policy making process has been democratized, and CSOs had the opportunity to engage and to propose amendment and to discuss the laws that are being discussed in the parliament. So also, thank you really. I want to thank you again, Buzi, for all the information that you captured. I will just go back to what we've done in Tunisia and present not just the context, but also some tips for the CSO that are being here with us that they can use in their future work. So we managed to produce evidence material. We embarked on research by establishing facts, by publishing a work paper, assessing the investment incentives in Tunisia. Also, we produced from that a policy brief on tax incentives to show if those tax incentives have fulfilled their objectives or not. But I will how to say it, go to another approach, how we did it, and something maybe that Busy didn't tell, that we are engaging with MPs, and those MPs are not always technical people or the economical people. So we had to vulgarize the information that we had. So this highlights the importance of giving meaning to numbers, to break down that technical information to visual information or very easy information to get. So as I'm presenting here, we are in this graphic, we are presenting how much the government is collecting tax and how much he is giving in tax incentives. And here you see that they are more equal. So he is collecting from here and giving that to in tax incentives. So when you present something like that to an MP, that helped him to catch the information and to see the importance of and the impact of the incentives that we are willing to change. Also, here we by this number we were able to measure the magnitude and the cost of the state budget to the state budget of the balance of payment, allowing the veil to be lifted on the main cause of the deficits, the effect on which are presented in an alarmist tone without ever explaining the causes. And here in this one, we are presenting the cost of tax incentives to create a job. And also, by the other hand, the same amount that the government is giving in incentives, if he gives them to grants in a specific program in Tunisia, how much he can, how to say it, create jobs. So for the same amount that he is giving in tax incentives to companies to create jobs, with the same amount, if he collected it and put it elsewhere in a grant, he can create 12.5 new jobs. So this correlates the narrative that's been always told to us. Also, I want to be brief, so I won't be going through everything because Busy really has captured everything. I also when we have been working on that since 2012 till 2016, and we had the opportunity that the incentive law is being discussed and the budget law also have been discussed. So we had the opportunity to go to the parliament and to discuss and to propose, since we've been doing that from 2012 till 2017. So we saw that opportunity. We have to attack the opportunity and not, how to say, to say we are proposing something, we want the change now. No, the work is a long, very long process. So yeah. After that, how we worked with MPs. Since the Tunisian context, we had access to the parliament, and we have been able to discuss, to also to exchange, to propose amendments with those with the MPs. But here in this specific case, we've been to the finance committee, and here is how to say it, a quick stratification of how we attack to approach the MPs, from ally, those to convince, or those who are really against what we are proposing. That have been analyzed by analyzing their votes in the previous laws. So it's really, how to say it, important to follow the work of the MPs and to follow their how to say it, votes, their political approach, and also to be as neutral and let the numbers talk. Also, I wanted to add, also being a member of a big network like TJNA helped us helped us to first experience exchange and learning from each other, like those sessions we learn from each other, and where we, how to say it, learn from, take the lesson learned from the others and to reproduce them in our countries. Also the building capacity from the how to say, the network. TJNA have been able to through its uplift program to build the capacity of some MPs, and that helped us a lot in the process of approaching them, also on proposing the amendments. And also a very important point that I wanted to highlight is how we as a CSOs search to how to say, to fund research in-house. This have been a big problem. I think it has been a big problem in the 3 use cases. So that's it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Busy. If there is any, I pass you the mic, Ismail. I hope I I didn't take a lot of time. Thank you.
No, you didn't. I mean, I think you spoke really well, and given us the Tunisia specific context. Thank you so much, Amin. At this stage, I'd like to invite Mr. Isaac Mwaipopo from Zambia to give the Zambia specific country context.
Thank you so much, Ishmael, and thank you so much to the presenter for the elaborate presentation that she has given. I was very excited to look at how similar some of the challenges that we face here are with what other countries are experiencing. And I should begin by agreeing with the findings of the study, particularly in the context of Zambia. To begin with, I would also want to just highlight that a number of civil society organizations actually struggle in terms of generating empirical evidence. This is due to a number of factors to which I can highlight two. One, a number of civil society organizations tend to have limited capacity within the institutions to undertake studies, especially here in Zambia. So one of the things that they opt for in an event that they have a project that needs the generation of empirical evidence before commencement of advocacy activities, they would have to outsource researchers who will then generate the evidence for them. But that in itself continued to prove to be a big challenge. The Center for Trade Policy and Development was equally in a similar situation a few years ago. One of the things that used to happen is that if you have an external researcher that comes on board, works with your team for about 3 to 4 weeks to put together evidence for advocacy, after you make the last payment, you find that as you begin the process of using the evidence time and again, you get stuck. You find that they'll ask you questions about some sections of the study, and for you to give a proper response, you might still need to engage the researcher who might have closed the case and probably moved on and forgotten about the consultancy that you had engaged them in. And as a result, you find that carrying forward the evidence used to become to be a challenge for most of them. The other challenge that I would want to also highlight, adding on to the findings that were shared, is also around the costs related to research. Research is quite expensive. It consumes quite a lot of resources, and there are quite a few donors that are normally willing to support research work. There would be more willingness to support advocacy work, but the generation of evidence is one area that received less attention in the recent past. But more recently, there is a bit of some improvement. We've seen a number of donors showing or demonstrating interest to support research work, and some of the research work being led by the civil society organizations themselves. And that in itself is a step in the right direction in trying to improve the quality of advocacy work that goes on. With regards to the approach that we have used in the recent past to ensure that the findings from the research studies we are conducting are adopted or taken seriously by policy makers, my comment or reflection would be that the strategies that we deploy normally vary depending on the type of study. One of the approach we have used, especially on the tobacco control project we've been implementing in partnership with the Tax Justice Network Africa and a few other African countries has been an approach of establishing a very good working relationship with a direct ministry that is developing the piece of legislation for regulating tobacco, and that is the Ministry of Health. But besides the Ministry of Health, in the first phases of the project, we also developed a good relationship with strategic partners like the World Health Organization. And one of the things we found during that process was that they used to have serious challenges to put across their arguments on why tobacco needed to be regulated, because they lacked empirical evidence. And every time they met in meetings with the producers of tobacco, the manufacturers, they used to be outsmarted in terms of engaging substantively on issues around tobacco control. So with the coming on board of the Center for Trade Policy and Development, it became quite a big relief, and evidence started being generated, and we started supporting them to improve the quality of their arguments, and even participating directly in some of the meetings. And this created a heavy reliance on the part of the Ministry of Health. And one of the things we started seeing was that every time they would be hosting a meeting and they know that they might have controversial characters within the meeting, they would always ensure that they tag us along, because they felt confident that should any issue emerge that might need defense using evidence, we might be in a position to provide that support, because the position that we had taken was in agreement with the position that they had taken. It's a similar strategy that we have used on other studies. I can cite another example where we have conducted a study focusing on appraising the gold mining sector and trying to see the extent to which more support can be provided to artisanal and small-scale miners. So with the approach of developing a good relationship, one of the things that we have seen is that it also enhances the government's receptiveness to the findings of the study, because they get involved in terms of the collection of data. And then you also find that before you launch the study, you also offer them an opportunity to provide their thoughts before you close up the study. But generally, we also see that we have a government in place that is receptive to ideas. It's a government that when you have empirical evidence that has been properly generated in terms of the quality of research, they generally do offer platforms for engagement. It's not only the new administration, but even the previous administration could easily offer spaces for local economic think tanks, civil society organizations to share their findings. Just like Ishmael had mentioned at the beginning, you find that strategic platforms, once they are convened and there is recognition that your institution has consistently been doing a particular type of work that involves a lot of research, you would even directly receive invitations that you make a case for the work that you are doing. So these are some of the strategies that probably other colleagues from other countries can try to think of in terms of trying to enhance chances of the studies being taken seriously. The extent to which the recommendations are adopted, it's not always like something that you would deem that 100% of the findings get adopted. It usually takes quite long. So there could be a number of consultations, and these consultations might involve policymakers themselves inviting you directly. A lot of them might actually then come through from oversight institutions like Parliament, where they seek for your views and opinions. But the uptake in terms of the findings is painfully quite slow. You might make your case, it might look interesting, but for it to get to a point where it is adopted and it becomes law, it takes quite long. We have had a few success stories in the recent past. Some of them have been changes that have been effected through instruments like the national budget, and some of them have been direct policy changes. But it's work that we have learned that needs a lot of patience, needs a lot of consistency, and you need to just keep the eyes on the ball. That would be our contribution in terms of our context here. Ishmael, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Isaac. I think that was a very, very clear presentation and gives the Zambia country context. At this point, I would like to invite Chinedu from Nigeria to give the Nigeria-specific country context. Nigeria was quite interesting because they looked at the informal sector in the study, which always brings about a big debate in how we should go about the taxation of the informal sector. So Chinedu, I'll hand over the floor to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Don't know whether you can hear me.
Yes, can hear you perfectly.
Okay, thank you. And I want to also appreciate the opportunity to be part of this. Just like you rightly mentioned, our context is basically on the informal sector, not that we didn't work on other the formal sector, but our major bias tend towards the informal sector, and that is as a result of the initial research that was conducted on the tax, both the perception and the effect on the people. And it showed clearly that the informal sector is at the receiving end of almost all the policies that are churned out, whether it's at international, national, or subnational level. So they are what we call the ultimate burden bearer. So, and that's where you find the bulk of the citizens, where you find the bulk of the people that barely go by in their financial capacities on day by day. So yeah, that's what majorly instructed by us to working on what will make the burden easier for the people that you find at that level of development. And like it was rightly said earlier on, our context, we have a lot of evidence that is being churned out on a very regular basis by most organizations who also work with us. And it will interest you to know that at CISLAC, we are basically interested in policy and legislative advocacy issues. And we are coincidentally also the National Secretariat of the Tax Justice and Governance Platform, which is an affiliate of TJNA, who works on issues around fair and equitable tax regime in Nigeria. So that gave us a very big platform to and responsibility to make sure that anything that goes around within the fiscal landscape and how much it affects the citizens or the people became subjects of engagement. And like it was pointed out in Buzi's presentation, many a times it is about what the policymaker is more interested in. It is about, will I say, in our language, the body language, which of course will encompass what their interest is and the timing itself. So most of these issues have been on right from inception when we started as a campaign, and we've been talking about them. They were only waiting for some specific time, or will I say key moments, when we could latch onto to bring about some of these issues on the table. And the global meltdown came very handy when most governments were running helter-skelter to look for how they can fund development locally. And we came around with most of our evidence or research to suggest a win-win situation, which was of interest to the policymakers, because at the end of the day, what they want is what we brought to the table, just how to get more resources to work and deliver on their governance mandate. And that's also, we did issues around the tobacco tax campaign. Of course, it has rubbed off. Right now, you know that Nigeria just introduced a sugar tax, which is also tailored towards same ideology as the tobacco taxation, where we increase tax on some type of food that is not good health-wise, not totally good health-wise, to also reinvest in the health sector to make sure that the health sector can take care of the emergencies that will come up through that particular lifestyle in future. Well, that's there are so many other questions underlying, but at least we can start from having the fact that policymakers now understand that you can actually not go somewhere else to look for funding to support the particular sector, that sector can easily fund itself by trying to discourage the use of those products. If, of course, where you don't have total control over how people live their lives, they pay for those funds that will be used to fund that. So we have cases where when the Buhari-led administration came on board, we understood that he has a bias toward the poor, and that formed an opening for us to bring about the issues around reducing the burden on the tax, the lowest cadre in the tax net, and introduction of the Finance Act 2019 exempted people that earn below a particular threshold, and even some businesses that are below a particular threshold, as showing that they actually listened to what we have brought on the table and how that has encouraged so many persons, young entrepreneurs, to go into businesses and be encouraged to grow into a threshold that they will now start paying more tax. And so many other instances, like the beneficial ownership disclosure campaign, the issues around automation, we had also stated in the presentation that BC made to make sure that at those local levels that we have a lot of proliferation of third-party tax administrators who are not authorized. At the end of the day, they form a form of leakage to revenues that goes to the government. And those leakages are in process of being blocked, where automations are being introduced. It's not yet 100%, but the process is appreciably on the increase to in most of the local government. An issue around the tax to service agreement was also something that we came up to ask, because the issue around low tax compliance in Nigeria became a subject of debate. And we came up with a research to show government how compliance can be increased when you allow them to have a percentage of what they generate to put in some amenities, especially markets right now, and some business environments which are at that informal level. And as at the time of this research, we had a few number which was stated, and I stand to tell you that the numbers are increasing right now, and a lot of other local governments are taking cue on that and establishing that to a greater height, and also to a better form of tax administration at that lower level. Because eventually the informal sector is termed a gray area. Of course, at the national level, it is not within their jurisdiction of what they do. So it's basically the responsibility of the state and the local government, where if you allow me, government or power is more centralized within a small group of policymakers, unlike at federal level where power, especially at fiscal decisions, are much more diversified. You have very strong independent institutions that at one point or the other have powers to make one decision or the other. You have the National Assembly, you have the Ministry of Finance, you have the Budget Office, you have the Federal Inland Revenue Services. These are all institutions that forms a powerful block. So most times it's difficult to have all of them agree to a particular thing at the same time. It takes longer time. But at the subnational level, you just have a fewer persons and a fewer hurdles to pass. And that had really helped us to get some of our research reports or evidence into the mainstream of governance. And basically, to wrap it up, to say that our major concern is that those that are the lowest cadre of economic capacity don't bear so much of the burden occasioned by whatever thing that happens both at the national or at the global level. Create a kind of a microclimate that enables them to still survive at their subsistence level and get by, and not being thrown out of business and increase unemployment, and of course, security issues and a lot of other political undertones that are attached to such situations. I think my time is up, and I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Chinedu. I think that was very, very informative, and you've given a clear picture of the country context in Nigeria. At this point, I want to open up the floor to the rest of the participants. What I was saying earlier is, you know, it's the start of the year, so I won't limit participants to the chat only. If you want to speak, you can raise your hand and I'll allow you to speak, and you can go ahead with your contribution to the discussion. I already have 2 hands here. If you want also, you can still utilize the chat function to give your contribution to the meeting. So I'll start with those that have raised their hands. I've seen John Akek with his hand raised, so I'll allow you to speak and you can go ahead with your contribution. John, are you able to speak?
Yes, please. I'm John Akech. I'm actually speaking from London, but I'm a South Sudanese. I'm the Vice Chancellor of University of Juba in South Sudan. My experience with evidence-based policy, personally, at some points in my career, I've been an advocate, doing work of civil society. 2011, I actually founded Academic and Researchers Forum for Academics and Researchers Forum for Development, through which we actually did some research to inform policy, including work I did in labor practice in order to shape the policies for the employment and recruitment in oil industry. However, I would like to share with you a contribution that I made in 2017, 2018 about fuel subsidies in South Sudan. Now, South Sudan, after war, 2013, it experienced a very high inflation and was actually caused by the deficit financing. So the South Sudanese pounds against exchange rate against the dollar actually dropped very fast, and in fact inflation rose. Now if you look at inflation index for South Sudan from 2011 to 2020, which is kept by the World Bank, is actually like over 20,000. Now if you look at East Africa, then the average from 2011 to 2020 is actually around not more than 200 on average. So you can see that. So there was a fuel subsidies that was enacted in 2016 when actual exchange rate has to be shifted and increased. And it was like 20% per liter. That was the fuel subsidies. So the government was trying to alleviate hardship by 2017, the fuel subsidies actually became it became actually a big burden, a financial burden, but they were not sure whether to, what impact it would be if you leave the fuel subsidies. So the cabinet passed around 2017, that fuel subsidies should be lifted, but they were unable to take steps towards that. There was fear that it could actually create political. So personally, I actually did the research. There was concern about public transport. So I actually did research over a few weeks, collected data and about the fares, the change of fares, and how do they, for example, public transport, the borders, the buses, matotos, and so forth. And then I did the analysis. One of the things that we found that actually, because fuel was subsidized, highly subsidized, and nobody knows by how much by that time, we were able to show that about 50% of people do not use, the government fuel stations. They don't fuel from, of the public transport, compared to 30% that will use the fuel station 3 times a week. So because subsidized fuel were actually long queues and so on, so people actually did without it. So we were able to show that majority do not use that. So in fact, and that didn't change the prices of the fares. The other thing that we were able to show through that report, which was actually presented at Development Policy Forum, which was attended by members of Parliament and the Ministry of Finance, we were able to show that actually the subsidies that we are doing, when you do the calculation, it actually changed from 20% in 2016 to about 93% in 20. So you put it this way, you are buying a liter, from East Africa by $1 and bring it to South Sudan and selling it at 7 cents. And you are actually subsidizing it, paying 93 cents. And we calculate how much it was going to go. It was, it's actually costing the coffers of the government. It was shocking, it was convincing, and the members of the parliament came in support of lifting of the fuel subsidy because it was too much. Secondly, it was actually not really, will not change very much the fares of the public transport. So I think in this case, it is whereby you actually show data, you show graphs. You can imagine a bottle of water, a bottle of fuel was actually, a liter of fuel was selling cheaper than a liter of bottled water. A liter of it was 7 cents. The bottled water in Juba was about 35 cents. Mm-hmm. And then we had to be very quantitative. and then show the graphs, show the value, and it was convincing. So this is one of the things I can actually like to share with you. At the moment, South Sudan has problem with the with taxation. We are not collecting a lot of tax, and that's why I'm very much interested in attending this Zoom meeting. So so that we can initiate. At the University of Juba, I have formed a group called Center for Social Economic Research, and we are doing all kinds of things to actually try to help the government of South Sudan. The university is doing it as part of the community service. And at the moment, we are looking at how the public, the pay of the civil servants has actually deteriorated from 2011 to 2020. And the salary remains the same, but the inflation has actually changed by 20%. We found that you need to restore the value of the salary, and you need to times by 139%. The government has approved to do it 2%, which means you double it. But for us, we say, no, it's more. And we are still pushing. And soon I'll go back to Juba and try to mobilize the members of parliament. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John. I think before I let you go, I just wanted to check with you. How did the public receive the decision by the government to remove the subsidy?
Yes, they were fine. They were okay, because the fear was based on intuition that people will go to street. But the fact is, I haven't actually mentioned fuel subsidies. When you are actually paying 93% subsidies and only 7%, it became a commodity. People actually were buying it, taking it, in the back door and selling it at the real value. So it was creating queues. So it became very convenient, because not only that, there were vested interests to keep the fuel, to provide the fuel subsidies, and they were selling it, in the black market, basically. It was actually being sold on the street. So the black market disappeared, and then you have everybody now, you go to East Africa as a trader, you bring the fuel in, you sell it, and you come just and stop and you go. Because, actually what was happening, there had been inflation in terms of, the pound has lost value.
What I should do, in addition to what we've been doing in this past time, trying to create relationships with policymakers, parliamentarians, members of the administration, very big milestone, and it's aligned with, because now I'm a researcher at the Tax Justice Network. So it's aligned with our goals for the next 2 years. We are aiming to see how our studies, our researches, our indexes can be used by the policymakers. And the experience that has been provided in this report is very relevant. And I look forward to most of the persons who have contributed to it, so that the goal of our action every day, will be met, a fairer tax across all our countries, and to allow to people to have a better life. That's the only thing that I wanted to say. Thank you, congrats, and I look forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Idris. Glad to hear that you are working with Jean Balambala, who is on the call. We work closely with Jean Balambala in Cameroon. There's a lot of work that we do specifically on scaling up taxation. I've seen a hand raised, Kirsten Nzungu, so I'll allow you to speak and you can go ahead with your contribution. Kirsten, did I say your name right? Your microphone is muted. Kirsten, can you hear me? Your microphone is muted. I have allowed you to speak. If you can unmute yourself, you can go ahead and speak.
Okay. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm Christian Nicholas Nzungu from Hope Africa University, Bujumbura, Burundi. I'm one of the teacher. I assisted in Department of Law, and for now, I'm admitted at Moshi University, Tanzania, as a doctorate. First one, thank you very much for this conference. And my question in this one,
it looks like we've lost Kirsten. In the meantime, I'll just read through the chat. For those that are asking to be added to our mailing list, I will definitely do that. We have the AfriTax mailing list, and we're taking note of the email addresses that you have included. We'll definitely add you to the mailing list. So we have a contribution from Leonard Wanyama from TJNA, who's speaking about the Kenyan experience in the use of research evidence. And he's saying, reacting to the question of working in the right spaces, as EATGN, which is the East African Tax and Governance Network, we focused on working with the Departmental Committee on Finance and Planning in the Kenyan National Assembly. This committee has a very specific job to find where the taxes will be coming from through examining the finance bill annually. We have therefore taken to them the message and amendments towards making taxation fairer, plus in some instances, more sensible. This has meant that within the whole revenue cycle of collection, allocation, and expenditure, we have specifically focused on tax collection alone to respond to the MP's question. If we are to make taxes fairer, where and how should we amend the finance bill to get adequate revenues for the coming year? We have also had significant media outreach to inform the conversation on our work with MPs, but also to push our messages on tax perception. So thank you very much, Leonard, for that contribution. I think we've taken note of that. That's very, very helpful. And we'll definitely, it's a lesson that can be drawn by some of the other countries present here today. Do we have any further contributions before I hand the mic over to Alvin to close the meeting? I think regarding your email addresses, again, we've taken note. We will add your email addresses to our mailing list, the AfriTax mailing list. We've taken note of that. If not, I will hand the mic back to our Executive Director, Mr. Alvin Mosioma, for his final words and rounding up everything as we conclude the meeting. Alvin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ishmael. And I think I'll be, based on the kind of the diversity of the conversations we have had, I'll be doing a bit of injustice if I try to again recap everything that has been spoken. I think it has been a very, very exciting conversations, and my hope is that we will find ways of taking this forward. And in the words of Idris, I think there is really opportunity here that can influence how we do our research, how we shape our advocacy strategy based on some of the findings and the recommendations of this report. Please allow me to speak to only 5 things that I think for me jump out. So on one side, while there is a lot of diversity in the presentations that have been made based on the issues that were being discussed, be they DTA, tobacco, informal sector taxation in Nigeria and others, and the different country context, I think there are a number of things that for me, listening to the different presentations, cut through the whole research. One is around the context of the messenger. Really, the messenger matters And here, I think picking up, for example, the example we had from Tunisia, the example we had from Siatini in Uganda, the credibility of the messenger is very, very important. And here, for example, you might be aware Siatini was recently awarded a very high award from the Uganda Revenue Authority as a credible partner. So when you have a situation where a civil society is perceived by the policymakers as a credible organization, as a credible stakeholder, then the capacity of the ability of government to take those evidences in the policy making exercise is increases out of that. The same applies to, again, on the messenger, the quality of the evidence that we produce. And I think there was again a point here about the need to not just generate evidence, but generate quality evidence. And I think it's the colleague from Nigeria who spoke about the costs of carrying these researches, and some of the recommendations I think that came out, particularly targeting the funders, is that it's not just about doing research, but you want to do credible quality research, and that is costly. The third point, I think, is the political environment or the perception that comes with the messenger. Again, is a messenger being perceived as partisan or non-partisan matters, but also the existing relationship that the messenger here has built with the relevant actors. And again, here I take the example of CPPD. They say that the kind of effort they have made, invested in building trusts with the different policymakers. It was again said by Amin in Tunisia about the relationship there with members of parliament. So I think in this conversation is really, really important to focus, particularly when we look at the messenger, on this particular issue about the credibility, the non-partisanness, the existing relationship, the quality of the evidence that the messenger is carrying. And that cuts across the different country context. The second point is the message itself. Again, how the message is packaged, how contentious is the message is perceived, the implications of the message in terms of the proposed changes, what are the costs of those proposed changes, what trade-offs need to be made for those changes to be affected, who are the winners and the losers of the implementation of the particular policy recommendations we are making out of those researches, and how the message is tailored or targeted to the different recipients. So many a times within our civil society sector, we tend to produce a research that is generic, that it targets policymakers, but of course, members of parliament have a different kind of entry point, as would be technocrats in the Ministry of Finance or the different actors that we rely on to implement these policies. So that, I think, in terms of the packaging of the message, how the language that we are using, the contextualizing of the message, all matters in terms of the research uptake. The third is the focus on the recipient itself. Who are the recipients? Many times we talk of the policymakers, but there is really need to kind of do and call a power mapping of the recipients when you talk about what is the scope and the extent of influence that the different recipients have. What is the capacity to implement when the recipients of the researches that we do, what is the capacity do they have? Do members of parliament have sufficient capacity actually to internalize some of the researches that are being developed? And that's why we at the Taxpayers Network Africa have been investing over a period of time, recognize the kind of value chain that is required for policy change to be affected, investing in building capacity specifically of members of parliament to be able to affect the change, because we feel they are an important actor in the change. The question of political dynamics and which basically, if you look at the actors between, even within the ministries, you find that one ministry is pushing for tax incentives while the other ministry is pushing against those tax incentives. The Ministry of Investment might be feeling the tax incentives will attract those investments, while the Minister of Finance or the Revenue Authority feel that that's eroding the tax base. So really understanding that how you're packaging the information to the different recipients and what are the scope of influence that the different recipients have in affecting the change. The fourth point, before I conclude, is the timing. And I think this came out very clearly from the presentations, particularly I think from Tunisia, if I remember well, about the momentum that has been created, which this kind of research evidence can ride on. Like, is there an existing, and I think Busi did mention this at some point, that in some areas where the uptake of research was very successful was also determinant that there was some kind of public demand, there was a pressure from the public to affect specific changes. And I think given the case of Nigeria, there was a similar example that was given. Timing is important. We can have very qualitative research that is well packaged, the different recipients, but the timing of it is not appropriate. And then, of course, it does not have the appropriate impact. So timing and time lag, I think I would have to also differentiate between these two, that some of these changes take time. They take time, and sometimes we tend to overlook this in our advocacy planning. The timing of when those recommendations are put out, the pressures, are there particular political momentums that might be created? Is it a campaign period? Is it Leonard mentioned, for example, the annual tax budgeting process? So the timing of those recommendations really matter. And the last point I think I would like to highlight is the kind of political economic context, which again I think is very critical. We live in a world where there's a dominance of neoliberal dogma, where the influence of the international financial actors, the IMFs and the World Banks. We know in Kenya here, for example, that the World Bank has been pushing for an increase in VAT as the so-called easy tax to collect. So being conscious that they are both politically dynamic or political dynamics that influence the uptake of this research, and more specifically in a situation where the neoliberal philosophies of the neoliberal theories are dominating our conversations. Then sometimes when we have researches that kind of go against the grain of those politics, even if the research is qualitative, it tends to have a less level of uptake. And of course, the role that donor countries play is also very significant. So really knowing that there are political context to which these decisions are making, and I think Busi did speak to that very, very clearly. This, for me, Ishmael, are some of the key things that come across, that cuts across the different presentations that we are making. And as we take this forward, we at the Tax Justice Network Africa are keen on taking this forward and providing support to our different members and platforms in the different countries to be able to delve deeper into this. As it had been said in the introduction by Busi, this is an exploratory research. We understand that there are areas that you could have dug deeper. Of course, the COVID crisis did interrupt the pace and the depth through which we could have done this exercise, but it's still a very, very, I think, exciting process that we have embarked on. I don't want to close before I specifically thank Busi and her team for the role and the leadership that they provided in getting this study done. The team at the Tax Justice Network Africa that was leading on this exercise. It's really great appreciation, and to everyone who took time to participate in this conversation. We would again request that you share with us your contacts through our email, then we can be able to add you both in our AfriTax mailing list, but also share with you the report for further study, and ensure that we can be able to continue having these conversations. Thank you very much, Ishmael, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Alvin. I think that sums up the entire discussion beautifully. Before I close, on special request, I'd like to allow Busi also to give a short word in conclusion.
No, thank you. It's a very, very short word, but I wanted to thank the 4 CSOs that participated in the study for being a part of, for giving their time and letting us into the workings of the organizations, into their advocacy, and the work that they've done. And just to, I think the work that all these organizations have done is really phenomenal and amazing, and to have studied it has been real pleasure. And so, thank you so much to those CSOs. And also, I mean, I know the policymakers aren't on this call, but to the policymakers we interviewed as well for lending us their time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Busi. And just to close the meeting, I'm seeing one more hand. I don't know if I should allow this one more hand. It's a new year, so I'll allow it just this once. So I can't pronounce Corson. It appears. You can go ahead and give your final contribution as we close the meeting. Corson, can you hear me? Your microphone is muted. Okay, it seems we don't have. So I think to close the meeting, I think there's a few people that I'd like to thank. To start with, I'd like to thank our Executive Director, Alvin, for making the time to be a part of the entire discussion and the contributions that he's given. Some may not know, but he was also key in the finalization and contributions to the report. I'd like to thank the team from IEJ, Busi especially, for the work done on the report and the contribution here in the meeting today. I'd like to thank the panelists present. I think all of you gave some very, very interesting contributions and giving the country-specific context. And I think that helped contextualize the discussion that we're having today. Fourthly, I would like to thank all the attendees present. I think most importantly, you have contributed meaningfully to the discussion. I'm looking at the chat. We've had over 14 different countries represented in this meeting today, which speaks to what Alvin was saying. What we're doing now was a pilot. We've done 4 countries, and we'll definitely be interested to hear from different countries, some of your country experiences. It was interesting hearing from Burundi, hearing from South Sudan, but also the other countries that are present on this webinar. I would like to hear more. So we'll definitely add you to our mailing list, and we'll see how we can engage each other further. Lastly, I would like to thank Mr. Ishmael Zulu for moderating this meeting and doing such a good job at it. So with those few words, I'd like to thank everyone present on the call. Have a good year, a happy new year to you all again, and definitely looking forward to carrying this conversation forward. Thank you.